Hi folks, warm welcome again to Introduction to Sociology. So the first book that we have assigned in our class is Michael Schwalbe's Sociologically Examined Life. And this week we are hoping to complete our readings for chapters 1 through 4 of that book. The PDF of the book is in our first module, so you should be able to see it there. It's also attached to the welcome letter, so you should be able to get hold of that PDF for absolutely free. So the reason I assigned this book is that I love the conversational style it has. It has very little jargon in it, and it's a very accessible text. I also like the fact that it's not unnecessarily glossy and simplistic, and it allows you to get a very broad picture of what a sociological perspective is. So the first chapter, as you can imagine, starts off with some very basic questions. We can start with some basic questions, and the purpose of this mini lecture is to cover some of the main ideas covered in those first 4 chapters. So if you start with the question of what is sociology, at the most basic level, it is the study of interactions and relationships among human beings. In my introductory video, I say that I like to think of sociology as the science of us. So we're studying these interactions and relationships in a very scientific manner. It's also the study of the rules of living together. So there are certain norms and traditions that we follow in every social context. And so sociology is about not only how we make up those rules of living together, how we socialize folks into learning those rules of interaction, and how we ourselves internalize those rules to form our identities, right? And also to learn norms and traditions of a particular context. And so the process of internalization is such that once you have internalized rules, they literally become parts of your personality. They become personality traits, right? And so it becomes a very unconscious process. You're not even necessarily thinking about it as much. Now, Schwalbe takes this one step further by introducing us to the idea of sociological mindfulness, right? And mindfulness would mean, from this sociological perspective, asking these questions about how the social world is created by people, right? How infants then through socialization become functional human beings, how we are interdependent, right? How our behavior is a reflection of our social context. Also, how our life, social life, is consisting of patterns within patterns. How circumstances or contingencies shape our fates, right? How appearances or impressions are strategically crafted. And very important in all of this is the role of power, right? How is power exercised, and how that gives rise to inequalities in their turn, how these inequalities are created and maintained over time, what we call maintaining the status quo. And then finally, how we can create valid and reliable knowledge about our social world. This is where we'll get introduced a little bit to the idea of social research. Schwalbe makes the claim that sociological mindfulness is rare, especially looking at this US context, right? And he kind of presents certain ideas of why he thinks this is rare. We can think about this on our own as well. One thing we do say in sociology is that we learn through discomfort, right? we will often discuss and analyze issues that make us uncomfortable, right? And you can dig in deeper and think about why do these issues make us uncomfortable, right? It could be that they're big parts of our personalities, our relationships. We don't want to question them necessarily, right? There's also another reason, which is this feeling of powerlessness. The idea that this is all happening at a very macro level, and what can I do as this one person in this larger scheme of things, right? So often folks don't want to think about it because they feel that they don't have the agency to make any difference. Another reason, especially in our US context, why sociological mindfulness might be rare is we are a highly individualistic society. And so any perspective which is talking about how our individual selves are shaped by our social context is not often part of our worldview, where there's a lot of emphasis on the individual attributes, individual personality, individual work ethic, and so on and so forth, right? And then finally, in our sociology class, we're also going to talk about the importance of labels, right? And how often labels can become obstacles to any kind of sociological analysis, because once you've labeled someone or something, you don't necessarily dig in deeper, right? Instead, in our class, we are going to emphasize evidence and logic rather than taking things such as labels for granted. Schwalbe addresses the issue of bias pretty head-on in these first few chapters, and he makes this bold claim that it is impossible to be completely unbiased, right? As human beings, we are part of our social context, our historical context, and therefore each of us brings a particular perspective. He says the mistake we make is not necessarily bias itself, which he's saying is impossible not to have, but the mistake is that we imagine that our perspective is objective and neutral, right? Because when you start thinking that your own perspective is neutral, then you are in fact imposing your perspective as the only perspective. That's the stuff of ethnocentrism, right? An ethnocentric perspective would absolutely think that their way of looking at the world is the normal way of looking at the world. And we will definitely explore that idea more in our other lectures. And so Schwalbe is saying that bias is a problem when it's so rigid that it keeps us from considering new evidence, new ideas, right? So the problem then is not necessarily that we have biases. All of us do have a value system, certain morals that we care about, etc. But the problem arises when we are held captive by our particular perspective, right? So in many of his early chapters, Schwalbe is talking about how we invent the social world through our shared beliefs and ideas, and then how these ideas in turn become really durable because they are embedded in things like tradition, religion, morality, feelings, right? And he gives us numerous examples throughout, and you'll notice that some of these examples are pretty provocative because he does want us to analyze things, make us uncomfortable again with things that we take for granted, right? So because these ideas become so durable, they become like habits, right? We don't even notice habits anymore. They just become the normal way of behaving in the world, and that's when traditions and other kinds of behaviors become closed off to critical thinking and analysis. And so here one of the ideas is really important to dig deeper into, which is reification. Reification is this notion that we start treating things as natural or given or innate when in fact they are socially constructed. Right? And it's a very, very important idea in sociology, because that opens up the door to critical analysis. Many of us fail to see the social world as humanly made, and that in turn leads to these social institutions and structures becoming really obscure, out of reach, right? That in turn leads to lack of accountability and that feeling of powerlessness, right? Because a lot of this seems just so opaque, out of reach. We don't really know how these things are working. We have a tendency to naturalize them, right? We have a tendency to say, oh, the free market, don't mess with it, as though the free market is this freely existing organism, right? The free market is a product of policies made by human beings, right? It does not exist in nature. And it's really important to unpack again how our social world is constructed rather than natural, because that means we are the ones that built it. We have the power to rebuild, undo things, remake things, and so on, right? So reification is the first step in sociological analysis, unpacking reification, because too often there's a tendency to think of institutions or things as real, right? It's a mistake to think of social constructs as real entities, right? To take them for granted. For instance, when you think of social class, how you are thinking of social class may be very different from how I am conceptualizing social class. You may think it has to do with family income, family education, and so on, and I might say, no, it has more to do with just the income of the person. And so it's very important to arrive at a nominal definition, which is an agreed upon reality. Because remember, we're saying reality is socially constructed. We will revisit this idea when we look at the concept of social construction. So in social research, it would be a mistake to study things as having real definitions. The first thing you would need to do is come up with a formal definition of what it is you're trying to study. For instance, again, social class. Most social researchers use SES, which is socioeconomic status, which is nothing but a composite of income and education of that person. And so sociological analysis means boiling it down to that operational definition, which is something that can be measured empirically, something that you can collect data on. Schwalbe goes on to encourage us to make connections between small things and big things, right? And he gives us examples of how gender roles, for instance, at work are always connected with gender expectations at home, right? And so if you are expecting equality at work, things have to change at home as well. He also tells us how to read indexes. And so we will talk more about this in our next video.